For those of you who haven't met me, I'm Leah Daragon. I'm one of the founders of Birth Roots and also the founder of Baby Roots Nature Camp, which started in 2019. So prior to 2019, we did not have an outdoor space. So Birth Roots had prior to that been in the West End where it's tightly packed. There wasn't even any parking. And then in 2019, we moved to our current location, which had a fenced-in yard, which allowed us to move our perinatal programming to include the transition from baby to toddler. Morgan and I were like, there's so much we try to cover in session one to orient everybody and give everybody the language and the frameworks. What if we offered people some time to take this information in a more relaxed way? And so today is our first time doing that, and then we'll have that on hand to be able to share with people. So if you look into the chat box, you can see people who are their name, where they are, their ages of their children. All right. So how we're going to proceed is we have a lot of kind of high level information that we're going to share. So we're going to share it twice. Once Morgan and I are going to introduce the concepts very briefly, just so you've heard these concepts. And then in a second time, or in a second pass through, we'll do a deeper dive. As we're going along with this information, if something is unclear or you have more of a question, go ahead and just type that in the chat box so that we can respond to it at the end of our slides. So an overview of what will be included in this session is the sensory system, but specifically that there are the 5 well-known senses, and then there are the 3 lesser-known senses. And so we're going to talk more deeply about the 3 lesser-known senses. We want to talk about providing differentiated support for those sensory-seeking toddlers and those sensory-reserved toddlers, because once you have a handle on concepts like sensory diet and what each different temperament needs as they work their way through those developmental milestones in toddlerhood, it becomes so much easier to care for and be responsive to those particular toddlers. We want to clarify the difference between sensory processing and emotional regulation. There's some overlap there, but a lot of people think what they're trying to figure out about their toddler has to do with emotional regulation, and it's actually sensory processing. And then doing a brief dialing into their developmental abilities, because at this age, the age that Nature Camp was designed for, some things have come online yet and some things are not. And the biggest one that we're going to hear from Morgan about today has to do with emotional self-regulation versus co-regulation. So the specific skills to spending time in the outdoor classroom and feeling confident about how to do toddlers in a group. Some people arrive at Nature Camp having parented a single toddler at a time, but when you put 10 toddlers in a same space, there's some need to be like, what are our community agreements around how to do toddlers in a group? So one of the benefits of creating a yes zone for toddlers and babies is they get to set the tempo of their risk-taking play. For some babies, it's risk-taking is being 3 feet from their caregiver. And for some toddlers, jumping off a stump is risk-taking play. It's just doing something that your body hasn't quite caught up for. And it's such an impulse to squish that into ooh, be careful, but we want to scaffold the adults and spot the adults around how to be excited about that risk-taking play. There is no such thing as a 100% yes zone. So where and when and how do we share our no's in our 90% yes zone? And then very specifically, the difference between taking turns and sharing and how to handle hitting, we're going to talk about in a little bit. So Morgan and I want you to have a chance to know a little bit about what happens in this outdoor classroom. It's an unusual setting for there to be a space like this for children under 36 months old. Most of the programming that's anything like this is designed for 3- and 4-year-olds and older, to have a space for 2 and 1 and youngers. We just want adults to feel prepared of what they're going to find. There is a lot of water. There's a lot of sand. Sometimes the sand and the water gets mixed. There's a ton of dumping. There's a live mud kitchen where a toddler is empowered to turn the water on and turn the water off. And so feeling relaxed about the dumping of all the water out of the water table or dumping the sand out. Morgan, what else are some ways that we want the adults and the caregivers to feel like, oh, okay, I was expecting to find this when I arrived?
I think we've really taken the space and thoughtfully curated it so that one, it can be a 90% yes zone. So, that kids have a lot of opportunities in this space that they may not have elsewhere necessarily. Dumping is encouraged, turning the water on and off is encouraged, leaving the water on is encouraged, right? That might not be encouraged in your house to leave the sink water on or the hose water on, but here, if you want the hose to stay on or the water coming out of the little mud kitchen, go for it. I think there's a lot of fantastic aspects of practicing what a yes zone could look like to give you some ideas of how you can either create a yes zone at your house, your backyard, figure out how to slip in some creative yeses in your daily routine. So that's really kind of what Nature Camp is set up to be, the space and the class, is to really kind of give you guys the tools to figure out how can I embed some creative yeses and what can I use, um, you know, that I may already have, that I may not have, and really how can I use the outside and nature to supplement my child's development.
And for those of you who are worried about water conservation, we have the ability to make sure that the stream of water coming out of the mud kitchen is a tiny trickle of water. It's like as slowed as it can be, and there's still, a meaningful amount of water coming out from a toddler's perspective. So there is water conservation mindset, but the fact that adults are not put in the position to micromanage children creates an environment where something very new and exciting happens because you're not put in that position. And it's not because immediately, depending on the generation your parents were part of, you might be thinking, why are we saying so many yeses? And the reason is because that's where that long attention span is built, is when we're not constantly redirecting toddlers and saying no to them. I think there was a study done recently that said on average, toddlers are told no every 9 seconds. And so if we can, expand that out to only once every 9 minutes, so basically like 4 times the entire time they're at nature camp, they get to explore, experiment, try things, find out that it didn't work without being told by an adult that won't work. So a funny example for me is there's these little stools. They're very light and toddlers can pick them up. And sometimes they'll stack a stool on top of a sand table. And the impulse to be like, stools don't belong on top of sand tables is right there for all of us. But the ability to be like, how interesting that a toddler is trying out an idea. And this concept of executive function is only allowed to grow if it's allowed to grow and experiment and try things and find out, oh, I don't think I want to leave that stool there because it's now in my way. So it's this space where toddlers are finding out for themselves, figuring out for themselves through the scientific process of experimentation and failure and try again and try a new idea. And I probably, to be honest, wouldn't attempt this indoors. There's something about it being outdoors that allows a yes zone to be like, yep, you're dumping all the water out. Yep, we'll add more sand before the next session because you focused your attention for 30 whole minutes on scooping up some sand and dumping it. And that's with my goggles, I'm like, wow, look at that attention span. Look at that focus. Look at that executive function growing. And so we want to lend you these goggles of why we have put specific elements in the space to be an amount of challenging without being too challenging. Anything more you want to add, Morgan, about? So there are some sticks and stones in the space, and so instead of removing all sticks and stones from the space, we empower adults to know how to assist toddlers with what sticks and stones are and are not for. So sticks need space. If you're interested in sticks, you kind of want to move your body away from where someone else is gonna get poked by it. And there's no small choking hazard rocks in the space, but there are some heavier, bigger rocks that can be painted, or you can make a little campfire out of it. And the ability of toddlers to pick up something heavy and move it is important for hand development. What else, Morgan? Have I left anything else out?
No, I think those are kind of the bigger things. There is like one small slide, well, two. There's like one toddler one, for really kind of those on the infant toddler brink, and then there's one larger one for the older toddlers that has like a little climbing component. Um, and some little like plastic playhouses as well that have a doorbell that is the center of attention for a lot of kids. Hearing
And
the
whether that door is
doorbell
open
ring and
or
ring and ring, or the door opening and shutting.
yeah.
But yeah, that's kind of at least what the space looks like.
Until very recently, the average playground was designed for someone over 36 months or over 36 inches tall. And so that's actually not all that safe for someone under 36 inches tall. I think very recently, a few of the playgrounds in the Cumberland County area have a more toddler-sized safe space, but creating spaces where a yes zone could safely exist is what we're going for. So some new vocabulary, and I'm going to need Morgan's help with number three here. The we don't want anyone to feel like, oh, I don't know how to say that word. So vestibular proprioception, and how do you say the last one, Morgan?
Interoception.
Interoception. I keep wanting to say interoception, and that sounds like a dinosaur. It's interoception.
Interoception. Like looking inward.
Yes, thank
I
you.
remember it.
Word. So things that have not come online for, like the difference between someone who just turned 12 months and someone who's almost 36 months old is wildly different. And people used to say, why can't my 3-year-old come to nature camp? And I'm like, because 13-month-olds are there, and a 3-year-old isn't old enough to keep a younger one safe. So we want to put parentheses around the developmental window of people working on similar things. So a quick and easy way to think about vestibular is if you were to close your eyes right now, would you still know what was above the horizon line and what was below the horizon line? And when you're a toddler, this isn't something you can hold on to with your eyes closed. You actually have to see it with your eyes open. And so, what matures or develops or integrates that vestibular system often has to do with turning a toddler upside down and turning them right side up again as a game. There's lots of games. And if you've ever done this with your toddler, you know that it instantly, well, nothing is true of all toddlers, as we'll talk about different sensory diet needs, but many toddlers are taken out of a bad mood if you push them on a swing, spin them in an office chair, or turn them upside down and right side up because it's growing and challenging that vestibular system, and they're going to need that vestibular system for later tasks. Would you add anything about the vestibular system, Morgan?
Basically just to give like a quick little insight is it's a sensory system in your inner ear. So it helps with balance, spatial orientation, movement, and perception. And so that's why I love to think of, that's why they're called toddlers, right? Teetle toddle all the time when they're learning to walk, balance. That's why you see trips, falls, bumps, bruises from learning to walk. But basically that's kind of a super quick description of the vestibular system. And then that vestibular input is that movement. So swinging, upside down, right side up, things like that. And those activities help develop the vestibular system for greater balance and coordination.
Mm. So proprioception, when I was first learning, like, what is the difference between vestibular and proprioception? There's so many P's in the word proprioception that I remember it that has to do with the right amount of pressure. So literally the ability to pick up a bug or a baby chick without squishing it or dropping it. The difference between squishing and dropping is not clear to a toddler because it's still coming online, that proprioceptive ability. So one of my favorite ways to think about proprioception is the ability to crack an egg, successfully getting the inner part of the egg out, but not getting any shells mixed in. And so a lot of expectations that we have of our toddlers are not aligned with their development because emotional regulation comes online around the same time the ability to successfully break an egg and not get any shells in. And sometimes we think it's several years ahead of when it really is. So games that can be played with toddlers that help mature and integrate proprioception have to do with like light touch games and deep pressure games where you're touching their body in very light and very deep ways. What else would you add, Morgan, around proprioception?
I like to call it, or a lot of us kind of in the clinical space tend to call it the sense because it's really your body's awareness of position and movement in space. So because it hasn't really come on board yet, that's why you see toddlers have a really hard time with personal space, knowing when they're too close or too far away, and that force gradation as Leah was talking about. So, if I pick this up, am I going to use too much force and this ball is going to go flying over my head? Or am I not going to use enough and I'm going to drop it on my toe? Things like that. But super great activities and games. Is anything stacking? Stacking is like a super fun and motivating activity for kids anyway, but trying to figure out different things to stack, whether it's, irregular like shapes, so different styles of rocks or things like that, different types of sticks, figuring out, okay, how hard do I need to put this down so that it stays on top, but it doesn't knock over the whole tower. That's like a super fun game that kids really, really like. As far as that proprioception input, right? So other activities to kind of develop it, jumping is huge, right? Jumping helps your body kind of know where it is in space in comparison to the kind of the world and the earth around you, right? You get some really heavy input from the ground as you're jumping. And so kids love jumping, climbing and jumping, and then climbing, jumping, and crashing is a great kind of combination. And that combination we really encourage because it actually works on both your vestibular and proprioception systems, kind of combining that movement and that where my body is in space.
And so these are great examples of when we sometimes think there's an emotional regulation issue going on, if we can instead put our like sensory lens on of, do I need to play some vestibular games with my child? Do I need to play some proprioception games with my child? And suddenly the emotional regulation comes online because you've engaged their sensory needs. So for a while now, the first two, vestibular and proprioceptive development, was part of nature camp, but only as recently as 1 year ago, last summer, we added the third, in.ter.o.cep.tion. Imagine not really being able to gauge whether the feeling, there's some kind of like uncomfortable feeling in your body, but you're not sure and you don't have the vocabulary for whether that feeling is, I might be thirsty or I might be hungry. I can't really articulate the difference. I might be hot or I might be cold. All I know is I'm agitated. The feeling I'm tired and the feeling I need to go poop are confusing to me. And so a lot of this needs narration and practice and modeling. So one of the things adults can do is externalize and internal. By the time you're an adult, all of this happens internally. But when you're a toddler, you need to be around people who are externalizing the sensation, oh, I have to go to the bathroom. And so when you start saying things like that out loud, the toddler's inner landscape starts getting populated with the like, oh, there's a feeling in my body. Maybe I've been sitting still too long and I need to move. Maybe I need to be picked up. Maybe I need to cry. I'm still sorting through all of that. What else, Morgan, how do we mature and integrate this in?
It's really, when I think of interoception, I really think about that brain body connection, right? Your mind and body connecting. And it's really the ability to kind of sense and interpret signals from your body and organs. So it's like your internal sense, knowing, kind of like Leah said, am I tired? Am I hungry? All of those things. When you're a toddler, you don't know those feelings. And so it's our job as adults to help you figure out what are these feelings. And so the first way to notice or to identify those feelings down the line is to notice the signals that your body is sending. And so a lot of times we kind of, because we're adults, we don't always pick up on some of those signals, right? And we don't really narrate them aloud because we have kind of mastered knowing what these different things mean. But kids don't. So one of the things that I really like to use the metaphor with is like pins and needles, right? Because it's kind of a concrete example. If your arm has fallen asleep or if your leg has fallen asleep and kids are like, oh, I don't know. They might start crying, they might start fussing, they might say, oh, they can't feel XYZ body part, or oh, it feels super funny. And then they're like, it feels kind of itchy or scratchy. So you, as the adult and the caregiver, labeling kind of some of those things and giving them the vocabulary to notice the signals, label the signals, and then interpret those signals. So how that's making them feel. And then leading into, okay, now we kind of have an idea of how you feel. How are we going to fix it or address it? right? Some things there's not a fix, but how are we going to address it to make your body feel more comfortable and kind of get back to that state of calm and regulated?
Hmm.
Does that make sense as like the kind of a good description for interoception?
Yeah, and just that these actually become functional later than we think they do. We think by
Hmm.
the time a child has, so one of the things that can happen for precocious talkers is that they can talk about things. It doesn't necessarily mean they truly are connecting. So it can give us the illusion, since they have a few words or their vocabulary is starting to grow, that a person who knows all of those words would know whether they were hungry or thirsty or tired or hot. But it comes online a lot later, and it doesn't come all online universally for all children at the same time. This is such an important thing to know, that you'll have one child who has one of their eight senses highly developed, but another one underdeveloped, and a different child is going to come, it's going to mature at different times for different children, which brings us to providing differentiated support for different beings, different toddlers, different humans going through all of this developmental arc and growth. So if you haven't already come in contact with this vocabulary around sensory seeking versus sensory, I've played around with what do we mean by the opposite of sensory seeking? Sensory sensitive. I feel like the word sensitive is a little bit loaded, like saying someone shy is a little bit loaded. Reserved feels a little less judgmental. Morgan, what about you? What are you currently using besides
I
sensory?
really like reserved because sometimes I think, so I like to think of it as everyone has their unique sensory profile, right? So everyone's body craves different things and different types of input and different basically sensitivities of input, right? Their threshold, everyone has a different threshold. So sometimes I find when we say it as like sensory sensitive, then there's kind of an expectation that they're sensitive to almost all sorts of input, which isn't really the case because you can really crave some input and be super sensitive to other input. So I really like the idea of reserved because it's a more generalized term for, okay, how are you for most? Do you like heavy input? If not, not really. So we're a little bit more reserved for the heavy input. But if you like the heavy input, then you're more of a seeker. And so I kind of like that terminology, and I've been really using that instead of sensitive versus not.
So some classic examples. I often think about it like some people like the music up really loud, that makes them happy. And some people like the music down as like background music. And neither person is right and neither person is wrong. So when it comes to all the different senses, we have the toddler who, when they eat yogurt, they like to rub the yogurt on their face and rub the yogurt in their hair. That's just sensory seeking behavior. They want to know about the yogurt, not just about how the yogurt goes in their mouth. They want to know everything about the yogurt. That same toddler could put their hands over their ears the minute, like, a siren goes down the street, and it's very upsetting to them when a siren goes down the street. Whereas another toddler is kind of curious and happy about the siren going down the street, but doesn't want to touch the sand at the beach or doesn't want their bare feet touching grass. So there's just so many ways to be sort of sensory seeking, sensory hungry, wanting more input from certain sensory experiences and wanting just a tiny little bit of input from other sensory experiences. And this is true of you as the adult as well. And sometimes adults and the children they're caring for are similar and sometimes they're opposite. And so this can create an interesting dynamic of who enjoys what and who doesn't enjoy what. Anything else to add here?
No, and it's just this will go kind of into the next slide, but this is really where those sensory preferences and that sensory profile that's unique to all of us as individuals impacts what we call our sensory processing, right? Um, and our emotional regulation. They're really intertwined. So your sensory preferences, right? So say that siren went by super loud. That child really didn't like it, put their hands over their ears. That may make them sad, upset, angry, who knows, right? The emotion. And so that's kind of our job as a caregiver at this age. Okay, they're getting upset. So what can we do about it? Say they didn't put their hands over their ears, but they were super upset by the noise. So modeling and teaching that like coping mechanism of, well, if it's too loud and there's nothing we can do about it right this second, put your hands over your ears because it'll make the sound a little bit less harsh for you, right? We can move away from the sound, right? Give ourselves some space and distance. So that's kind of where these pieces are super intertwined because toddlers do not have the ability to what we call self-regulate. You and I as adults, I mean, there's even some adults who don't have this skill or are still working on this skill all the time. I think it's fair to say that most of us are still working on this as we get older and move down, move throughout life. It's kind of a lifelong skill that we hone and develop, but we can't expect toddlers to be able to self-regulate. Self-regulation really comes on much later than we expect. And so it's our job to dial into their developmental abilities. So, kind of where are they in their development? Where are they on this continuum? And how can we, as their caregiver, continue to support that development and support their emotional regulation development so as they get older we can transition from what we call that co-regulation piece to that self-regulation piece. And so that's kind of where they're so intertwined. And, sometimes say we're feeling a little bit antsy, right? Our leg might be bouncing. We're feeling like we need to kind of get up and move, right? So that can make us feel a little anxious or stressed or a little bit inattentive, right? And so that's where that sensory system is saying, hey, I need some vestibular input, or hey, I need some, proprioceptive input. And that's where it's tying into that emotional regulation piece of, hey, I'm feeling a little bit inattentive. So then where are we going to, how do we make them meet? Well, we look at what we call our coping skills. And as an adult, we have kind of a toolbox of coping skills of things that we've tried and are either tried and true that really help us. We've tried and are like, oh, those didn't work for us. But it's our job as caregivers to start to introduce these coping skills and these strategies and help your toddler or child develop a toolbox that they can use and carry on later through life, and then develop the skill to learn, hey, this strategy is not working for me anymore. How can I experiment to find other strategies to add to my toolbox? Because your toolbox is ever evolving.
Morgan's about to do a great talk about what actually is co-regulation, but before she
Yeah.
does that, I want to share a tool I often share at nature camp in the outdoor classroom, and I call it the shock and awe face, where you overly exaggerate a look of surprise on your face as though maybe you just won the lottery or someone's giving you a surprise party and everyone jumps out from behind the couch. If you can increase the dosage, this is important. Maybe currently you offer a facial expression that looks like this. Whoa! Maybe you do that once or twice a day. A lot of toddlers need that facial expression of reactivity from you, not in a negative reactivity, but in a positive reactivity, like 20 times an hour. See what happens if emotional regulation doesn't come become more like flexible and calm if you are exaggerating emotions on your face. So say someone hears a loud siren and they're upset, they don't know what to do, that the loud noise is in their ear. And you say, "Come hide your face in my lap." And you hide your face and then it goes away and they look up at you and you're like, "That was really loud." There's just a way that toddlers need this over exaggerated reaction so that they can, like I said, populate that inner landscape of what I felt inside was reflected by an adult who showed surprise or consternation, or, like you're going to kind of become like a mime of all of the human emotions. So, Morgan, are you ready to talk about co-regulation?
Absolutely.
And just so everyone knows, a similar to this 1 hour Zoom is going to be offered called Milestones Mindfully, where we talk about the difference between milestones from a clinical perspective and milestones from a caregiving perspective. We can talk about that more a bit.
Yeah. And that this piece will also be in that one a little bit as well, just kind of in a different sense in regards to milestones for co-regulation and self-regulation. So, the easiest thing is let's start with what each is. So, self-regulation is the ability to manage or regulate our own emotions and behavior. And self-regulation actually does not really come on board until kids are like 6 or 7 years old. So, that true innate ability to be able to regulate your own emotions or their own emotions is not until 6 or 7 years old for like a typically developing child. And it comes on board after consistent co-regulation. And that really those opportunities to develop the self-regulation skills, right? And if we don't have that consistent co-regulation, then often we don't see self-regulation come on board until even later or ongoing struggles with self-regulation, right? So then what is co-regulation? So co-regulation happens when two people help each other regulate their emotions. And so when we're talking about a toddler and a caregiver, it's really that we're still co-regulating, right? Two people are helping each other regulate their emotions. It's a little bit more one-sided though for that dynamic than as compared to two adults, right? So for two kids, or for a child and an adult, right? We're not expecting the child to necessarily fully regulate our adult, right? It's kind of a little bit more one-sided. So really it's the expectation that the caregiver is going to help the child regulate their emotions during tricky periods of time. So there's kind of three key pieces to how to provide co-regulation. The first one is providing a warm and responsive relationship. So having a really caring, responsive relationship where you can kind of be intuitive, and have a good understanding of your child. Understand kind of the signals that they give, some of their like triggers of things that, say for the siren example, your child doesn't or the child doesn't necessarily like loud noises. So to the best of your control, setting up it's going to go into the next one, structuring the environment so that they're not constantly exposed to loud noises to the best of your ability, right? So you're not going to have the music blaring, if you know that your toddler is a little bit more sensitive to louder noises or things like that. And then model and coach self-regulation skills. So really kind of some of those things that we've already touched on, is that piece of you as an adult modeling those skills and strategies for your child. So say you knock over your entire glass of milk, right? Because that can also be something that happens pretty frequently for a toddler, right? Super upsetting. Instead of getting super upset and huffing and puffing and saying, "Oh, I can't believe I did this. Now I have to clean this up. Like, why didn't you just listen the first time?" Things like that of, leaving the cover on or keeping the cup on the table, taking a deep breath, really being like, that was super frustrating that I just spilled that. It was an accident. Accidents happen. How can we fix this? Oh, there's a dish rag over there. What if we wipe this up together? Right? And really just taking that opportunity to reframe because you're teaching your child so much. You're starting to build that emotional resilience. You're starting to build that coping strategy of taking a deep breath. You're starting to be able to give your child vocabulary to label their emotions and then eventually to identify their emotions, right? So here we kind of have another slide of just some other general co-regulation strategies. So some skills that are really helpful during this period of development. So pausing, stopping and pausing together. I love to call it the purposeful pause, and I use it in so many different aspects. And really, it's just let's stop, give ourselves a second to kind of recoup, figure out how we're feeling, what's going on, and just observe. Observe the environment around us, observe our internal state. That pause gives us the opportunity to do that. Sometimes we're just moving so fast that we don't have that second to identify really what's going on internally or what's going on around us. Actively listening is another great one where you're really just sitting and listening to your toddler, trying to figure out what the root of the problem is, right? So say your toddler might be having a meltdown because their sibling colored on their paper, right? And they're super upset by that. It might not be asking some general questions like, "Oh, it looks like you're really upset. Tell me what happened." They might say that their sibling was being mean or their sibling colored on the paper, but then figuring out kind of the deeper reason. Oh, well, maybe they're feeling a little bit picked on by their sibling. Maybe they were drawing that picture specifically for you and they were going to give it to you as like a shared moment of affection and their sibling just colored on it. And so it in their mind is kind of ruining that affection. So how else can we do it? We can make another one together. Are there other ways that we can show affection? Like, do you want to hug? Do you want to sing a song together? Things just really getting to the root. A lot of times we are so quick to kind of be like, what's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong? And especially in toddlers, they're not going to have the ability to tell us necessarily what's wrong. So, really about digging deeper, actively listening, and then reflecting on what they're saying. Repeating it is super helpful because a lot of times when you repeat it and put it into digestible information and language for both yourself and your toddler, you'll hear that they're able to say yes or no and kind of give you a little bit more context into the problem, really validating those emotions.
One of the things that makes this so tricky is that it's safe to say that the vast majority of us did not grow up in a home with high emotional intelligence skills. Like our parents were loving, they cared for us, they kept us warm, they fed us, they did all of the right things, but that doesn't mean they knew how to co-regulate or they brought this level of validation and reflection. Like a lot of our parents were stressed, they had to get places, and so that's a well-worn path in like neural pathway for us. And so this is like learning another language. And if anyone's ever tried to learn another language, it's slow going. You might go to an old neural pathway and then be like, whoa, 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 let's come back over here where I can model emotions, name emotions for vocabulary, because it's caring for a toddler 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, who their vestibular and proprioceptive systems aren't mature yet, their impulse control is not there yet. That's exhausting. And so we just come up short with our patients sometimes. So I wouldn't want anyone to feel like, oh, I'm not doing a good job if they're hearing this information and reflecting on ways they may have not been able. You don't need to do this perfectly 100% of the time for it to make a difference.
It's a lifelong skill that develops, and there's so many opportunities that we have to practice it. If we don't get it right, it's not a huge deal. It may seem like a huge deal, but there's always time to kind of go back and repair, right? We exploded. It happens. We'll go back, repair, make apologies, things like that. That in and of itself is just a huge win for teaching emotional resilience.
So just a heads up, when you are in a nature camp in the outdoor classroom and there's 10 other toddlers in the space, the ability for your toddler to navigate that situation, especially for many toddlers who arrive, this might be the first time they've done groups. Maybe they've been at home, or some toddlers have been in childcare settings. But the impulse control is not there, so we should not be surprised or shocked if somebody who's frustrated about something loses control of their hands. And the first thing that I like to say is that when one toddler hits another toddler, it does not mean the same thing that it would mean if I hit you. If two grown-ups lose control of themselves, it's a completely different set of meaning than when someone whose impulse control isn't there and their vocabulary isn't there and their ability to articulate what's happening for them isn't there. So there's no judgment of a good person or a bad person that needs to come into what we're going to agree to do in the outdoor classroom. Step number one, we know that inevitably and eventually someone's hands will start swinging. And so while we're together as a group, one eye and one ear is sort of listening for that sense that the child that we brought might be getting frustrated. You can sort of hear in either their voice or their body language that they're getting agitated or frustrated. And the skill that we've observed that might be new for a lot of people is to insert your hand or elbow in such a way that the arm that, I think you called that arm that got cocked doesn't make contact with another toddler. So your goal or your assignment as the caregiver of a toddler at nature camp is to, one, expect that a hitting could happen at any point, and that you are going to be quick to help that the hand doesn't make contact with another person. So we've created this graphic as a way to boost your confidence that, it feels bad to be the grown-up whose child was doing the hitting, and it feels bad to be the grown-up of the child who was hit. So we just want to create a safe place where everyone is going to remember that children are irrevocably good. They do have temporary struggles where they're getting dysregulated, and it's the job of the grown-ups to manage the situation. We're not going to ask 2-year-olds to manage their frustration. We already know that they can't yet. They will later, but they can't yet. So some things you can do is invite the child in close, engage warmly, do a sensory game together, or shift towards an alternate activity, or maybe even become their playmate for a few minutes. What it tells me when someone's hitting is something about this situation is not working for them. Maybe they're overwhelmed or overstimulated. Maybe they need you to be playing with them for just, you don't need to play with them for the entire hour that you're there. There's opportunities to connect with other adults for you. But for a couple minutes, like 2 or 3 minutes. So most importantly, do your best to insert your body, your hand, your elbow to stop the hitting from making contact. And then in a more general way, staying curious about what your child may be needing help with and name the struggle if possible. If you can figure out what the struggle is, which there aren't a ton of toys per se in the outdoor classroom. There's mostly duplicates of open-ended materials. So there's, tree cookies, which are not edible. They're just stackable. There's rocks. There's some tools versus toys in
Yeah.
digging. There's lots of stainless steel receptacles for carrying water all about. And so there's generally more than one. The one place where the sharing conversation comes up is around the doors to the little cottages. One toddler wants the door open, one toddler wants the door shut. And so if I hear what I call a hotspot developing, I move my body over towards the door and I might start doing what's called sports casting, where you just say out loud what's happening. You name the struggle. Looks like someone wants the door open and someone wants the door shut. What do humans generally do when this happens? And so you get curious, you stay curious, you ask if you can help, you ask if they're interested in doing something else, you narrate, it looks like someone else is trying to make something happen. Um, and then if as the grown-up of the child who's doing the hitting, you're doing some problem solving, and it's not really coming together, you can pull Morgan or I in to be like, how can we shift this sensory setting? A classic example of shifting the sensory setting is I occasionally get a toddler who's really interested in causing an enormous splash at one of the water tables. And I notice that I first look, some of the other toddlers may very well be into this splashing and thing that's happening. But if I look at the other toddlers' faces and I see people being like, no, I don't want to be splashed, I invite the splasher to do, I say yes to the splashing, but I say no to the context of the splashing. So this is where we try to turn yeses into no's into yeses by saying what you want to do, that impulse, that need to splash, totally fine. We're just going to take that splashing over here because it's bugging people.
And
But
a
sort of,
lot of times I think, I don't mean to interrupt you, Leah, but
no, go
just
ahead.
we're adding that kind of, it's that creative yes, right? So not necessarily using that no, being like, oh, it looks like you want to splash. Our friends don't want to be splashed. Let's go splash over here, right? So we're still saying yes, but no isn't in that vocabulary.
Mhm.
And so that's like a key aspect because based off of what Leah said, toddlers hear no every like 9 seconds. And then we wonder why they get super frustrated, super dysregulated because we're always like, no, 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 no. And they don't know what to do instead. That's another huge piece to this. Toddlers, again, they still have to learn. So by us just saying no and expecting them to go and figure out to do something else or how to change what they're doing is a really high expectation that's not super developmentally appropriate. And so again, modeling, showing them alternative ways.
I even once had a toddler who was super interested in kicking, and the toddler kicked another child. And I was able to be like, whoa, time out. We're the kicking is a great thing to do. You can kick a ball, you can kick a tree stump, you just can't kick other people. That's the problem, is the object of the kicking, not that kicking is the problem. So I was like, what else can we kick? And we went around and we kicked some stumps, we kicked the posts. And so I took an active interest in the kicking. I just set a boundary with what you could kick. And so it's like 50-50. Yes, you can kick. No, you can't kick that person. So these are just things we're going to practice together at nature camp. But I did want to lastly say on this slide that if you have a toddler who is so dysregulated what, maybe their nap got interrupted, maybe they woke up at 5 o'clock that morning, maybe who knows what's going on. If a toddler just cannot settle despite multiple adults being creative and problem solving, it sometimes is sad, but they might just not be able to be in that environment right this minute. Next week, they might have a great time and be able to engage all the materials and dump and carry and do the thing. But if you give it a good try and you redirect and you offer some things, every once in a while, it just does happen that persevering and pushing to stick out the whole hour isn't the thing. So there's an hour's worth, but maybe your sensory reserved child only needed 45 minutes or 40 minutes. Sometimes outward hitting or biting is actually someone saying, I need distance and space from too much stimulation. So just being able to interpret correctly as opposed to the idea that they're being bad. We want to find the yes instead of the no, and we also want to remember the irrevocably good part. Anything more to add to this one, Morgan?
No, just to kind of really remembering that you may be in the role of the child that you brought may be the one hitting or the one receiving one. And we know that, as we just kind of said, hitting happens. We know that everyone's going to try their best to block a hit. Sometimes it happens, and we're here to help you kind of process through. And sometimes we have a lot of families who, after a situation unfolds, want feedback, and it's a super great learning moment for kind of everyone in the class, not necessarily focusing on like the kids or the situation, but how could we have done something differently? Like, what did we do really well? What worked super well? And what did we find out, hey, that did not work? And so it's just a really good opportunity for learning, and it's never meant for judgment.
So on the topic of saying no in a yes zone, the hard no's that we have is you can't go vertical on the sensory stations. So you can't go vertical on water tables, you can't go vertical on sand tables, and you can't go vertical on the mud table. So as the caregiver of a child, you will actually want to redirect them away from standing on top of the mud kitchen, standing on top of the sand table, or getting in the sand table. Um, However, with our magic formula of turn a no into a yes, you can't climb on the mud kitchen, but you can climb on the slide. You can climb on the stumps, and we can do some 1, 2, 3 jump. This is a really great developmental task. A 1-year-old can't do 1, 2, 3 jump and then jump on the word, but a 2-year-old generally can time the tempo of their body to jump on that last word. And so we get to practice, a lot of practicing, and there's the right size stumps out in the space for that. So if you ever find yourself feeling like I need to tell my toddler, no, 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 turn to Morgan or I or whoever the guide is on that day and be like, how do I turn this no into a yes? Because it's usually like, I can't let you climb on that, but I can provide this alternate climbing space. And lastly, a lot of adults, parents, grown-ups who come are feel like it's an important reflection of their good parenting that the child they brought is skilled at sharing. And sharing isn't something that I would expect much before 4 years old. Like a 3-year-old who can share is way ahead of the curve. But what we can help people with is, what does it look like to take turns? Meaning, what does it look like, feel like, sound like to be told someone's waiting for a turn? So let us know when you're done, without pressure, but let us know when you're done. And then really turning our attention to helping the person who's bummed out that it's not their turn yet. So we're, rather than interrupt someone's long attention span around trying to solve a problem or be creative, we're going to say, well, they'll let us know when they're done. We're not going to force sharing here. But you're feeling bummed that it's not your turn quite yet. How can I help? How can I either how can I help you find something to do, or how can I just be with you while you're sad or bummed out that it's not quite your turn yet? So either of those outcomes is fine. Sometimes people cry at nature camp because it's not their turn, or they fell down, and nature camp is a yes zone to crying. It's not like don't have a tantrum here or don't cry here. Certainly, crying happens at nature camp. Sometimes someone will trip a little and fall a little bit, and it's an opportunity to let some pent out tears and emotion come out. So I'm like, I always say, let those tears wring out the sponge, because mostly we're told to help our children cry for a short amount of time as possible. But what if we flipped it to let that crying be as thorough as possible? So sometimes a good cry happens over a little spill or fall or bump or bruise. And one of my favorite sort of his name is Teacher Tom, if you've ever followed someone. And he says there's an ideal number of bumps and bruises for kids, and that ideal number is not 0. So a child who has 0 bumps and bruises is probably being held in too tight and not being allowed to try any of that risk-taking play. We already talked about hitting. Anything more on this slide you want to add, Morgan?
No, I think that's really it. Yeah, and a lot of times one of my biggest tools in my tool chest for the sharing piece and the turn taking is, oh, it looks like they're still using that when they're done. we can have a turn. We can, while they're using it, we can watch them use it and see what they do. Oh, there's one that's just like it over here. We can use this one and we can use it next to them or things like that. Or we can just walk away and come back later and see if it's available. Those are kind of like the three really awesome redirects for that turn taking and sharing piece.